our speakers first. So we're really thrilled to have with us this morning Dr. Tobias Feakin. Toby is Australia's inaugural Ambassador for Cyber Affairs and Critical Technology. He commenced as Ambassador for Cyber Affairs in January 2017, before having his mandate expanded to reflect the central role that technology issues have in geopolitics later in 2021. Toby leads Australia's whole of government international engagement to advance and protect Australia's national security, foreign policy, economic and trade, and development interests in cyberspace and critical technology. So just a very small job there. Ambassador Feakin is also a senior fellow at the Royal United Services Institute at RUSI, and he's a member of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They have a Fin Cyber Advisory Group, which focuses on developing an international strategy for cybersecurity and the global financial system. After Toby gives a presentation, we're going to turn to Will Middleton. Will is the Cyber Director at the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. He's also responsible for leading the UK's international policy programs and people to deliver the UK National Cybersecurity Strategy. Before taking up the role in June 2020, Will was the additional director for Eastern Europe and Central Asia. Will's worked for the British government in Pakistan, Spain, and the US, and prior to joining the FCO, he worked as a journalist. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Camino Kavanagh, who will give a kind of response to Ambassador Feakin and Will Middleton's presentations. Dr. Camino Kavanagh is a visiting senior fellow at King's College London in the Department of War Studies, and she's also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, where her research focuses really on international security, governance, and emerging technologies. Camino is a member of the UNIDIR advisory support team to the UN, both the open-ended working group and the group of governmental experts on ICT and international security. And she was the UNIDIR rapporteur to the 2016-2017 UN group of governmental experts. So very, very insightful person who's worked at the heart of these issues for a long time. She's served as a consultant or an advisor to a number of entities, including the Executive Office of the UN Secretary General, supporting the development of the Secretary General's strategy on new technologies, the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs on digital technologies and mediation in armed conflict, the OSCE work on confidence building measures and ICT, the OAS on cyber diplomacy and scenario development, and the government of Switzerland on projects relating to responsible behavior in cyberspace, or the Geneva Dialogue and preventative diplomacy. Camino's also advised non-governmental groups such as ICT for Peace on a range of ICT-related normative and policy initiatives. So three incredibly knowledgeable people working right at the kind of front lines of these issues of both national and international cybersecurity. Be really a very interesting morning. I don't want to take up any more time than I have with introductions. So I'd like to just hand straight over to Toby. We'll have a Q&A at the end following Camino's wrap up. Toby, welcome.
Madeline, thanks so much. How nice to see you all. As we all wait with bated breath, I'm sure everyone is in anticipation of England versus Germany this evening. I almost feel like we're the warm-up act. So there's a big status that we're holding there, but I couldn't think of three better people to be with, to be in that warm-up act status. Madeline, wonderful to see you again. Camino, what a pleasure. It's been a while. Great to be in the conversation. And Will, absolute honor. Thank you so much for being here and having this discussion. I think I'm really excited to hear what you've got to say. Couldn't feel closer to the UK in terms of the direction of travel of the integrated review, and really fascinated to hear a bit more about the Indo-Pacific slant that's within that strategy. We were really excited to see that from down under, but really excited about the conversation that we're going to have today. Always a delight to be back at RUSI. From many moons ago was my original home, so lovely to be back, albeit virtually. Love to have been there in person, and usually would have been to have this really important conversation. And in terms of what I want to do, I just want to do a bit of scene setting, because I think always the real value in these conversations is the discussion that you get into afterwards, when you steer clear of any notes that you have in front of you and wander into paths that, especially if you're a government official, become ever more perilous. But I think that's a fun line to tread when you're in government. And I think genuinely for these positions, that's where we need to be, because we are in the frontier of diplomacy. We're in the new frontier of diplomacy in guiding our government's national interest through what is an ever more contested and complex environment. So I just want to talk a little bit today about how Australia views that international environment. Why is it that we would think to have a strategy when you're working in that kind of environment? And then what does that mean for our international engagement? And how does it mean that we can work better together in terms of delivering mutual objectives in that complex environment? And as I say, Q&A, excited to engage with any questions that everyone might have. Let me start with the blindingly obvious, but always important to say, technologically right now, I really sense we are in a tipping point in the global environment. There is no doubt, if you look around you, you will see the way in which countries are competing in the critical technology environment, in cyberspace, not only for all of the nefarious ends that you do often see reflected in news stories and in public discourse, but also in terms of the way that we're relating to each other from a trade perspective, and the way in which countries are ever increasingly defining their 21st century economy through the lens of this critical technology space. I mean, what do we mean by critical technology? We've been intentionally quite broad in terms of our definition, which is essentially any technology which is critical and essential to our national security, our social cohesion, or our economic future. And I think having a broad definition is important so that our policy cycles don't get caught out very, very rapidly, because the rapid change that we're seeing in the tech environment could easily catch you out if you begin to, if you like, nail yourself to the floor in terms of very specific definitions in the tech space. So, you know, what are we in at the moment? We're in a tech environment where comprehensively the way we're living and working, especially in this COVID environment, has fundamentally shifted. And I think it's good that we keep reminding ourselves of that and reminding ourselves we've come a long way, despite the horrific nature of going through a pandemic cycle. We've come an enormous distance in terms of our digital transformation journeys as societies and the way that we interact with one another. And there's no doubting that a whole range of critical technologies, especially those building off the backbone of cyberspace, are really going to continue that digital transformation and continue the way that our economies and societies will essentially grow and emerge from this current pandemic situation. But there are challenges and there are fundamental issues that we need to be engaging with in the international environment to ensure that the future that we want to see, which is enabled by these technologies, is a future that is genuinely beneficial to not only our societies, but as broad a part of the global community as possible. So, you know, we've seen some of those challenges to our values, to our human rights and freedoms. In these technologies are fundamentally shaping many of these issues. And they can also pose difficult ethical questions which have significant real world impacts in our lives. And that's something that we are working our way through as the Australian government, UK government, as a global community is, well, you know, how do we manage those opportunities and ensure that the risks and the challenges don't outweigh those fundamental opportunities that we're so keen to maximize. So what is that international environment? Well, we can dig into much more detail, I'm sure, in the Q&A and through the subsequent discussions that Will and Camino provide us with. But it's that contest that we're seeing going on essentially in the tech space. we've seen it before in history, but I would challenge anyone to really come up with a comparable historical context. And I know me and Will have discussed this in the past, and you might have some ideas on some good historical reference points. But I still struggle to think of a time when you see this range of technologies which are maturing at a similar rate of knots, whether it be AI, machine learning, quantum computing, blockchain, and even cyberspace itself, which is still ever evolving and moving forward. And all the data sets that are provided off the backbone of cyberspace and what it provides for the biotech world. If you look at all those technologies in their sum total and the way that they are reshaping our 21st century and the way that countries interrelate and the way their economies are formed, it's really hard to pinpoint a time in history with that culmination of maturing technologies all at the same time. But I'd love to have a comparable example at some point. I'm sure someone will defeat me on that challenge at some point. I should find one myself, but good challenge to put out there to the floor. And ever more obviously, we're seeing the cyberspace competition fall out into the open domain. Long ago, this was something that was so secret and so hidden in the shadows that it would be incredibly rare that anything like this would ever come to fruition in the public domain. Now, it's hard to avoid an issue that nation states are dealing with at scale, at pace, in a persistent manner. You only need to reference the colonial pipeline issue, the issues that we've had here with meat distribution companies through various ransomware issues. Then you can name a whole stream of different incidents, whether they be NotPetya or WannaCry, which have had global impact at scale. And these aren't decreasing in terms of their frequency and impact. Which is a fundamental challenge that we are still trying to deal with. So, we also see that some states are challenging international peace and security, challenging the margins, and we are all, four of us, the chair and speakers, dealing with that in various ways and advising on how we deal with that in the international system. We can see how the technology is being used by states to fundamentally undermine human rights and freedoms. And that, again, is becoming ever more frequent and actually made infinitely easier through many of these technologies that are coming online now. And dangerously, the interference in democratic processes, again, something that we are seeing far too frequently and is being made all too easy and all too cheap to deliver through various digital means. And so it's affecting a whole array of national interest in our foreign relations and our international relations globally. And that makes it incredibly difficult for countries to try and maximize the benefits when we're constantly seeing these challenges in the international system. So essentially that tees up, well, that's why you need a strategy, simply put, because if you are not engaging in that international environment and trying to shape it very directly, trying to counter the negativity that you're seeing go on and the challenges to our international security settings, well, we're not going to make the most of that. So that's why Australia have come out with an international cyber and critical tech engagement strategy, which is meant to really just put on the table, here is Australia's view on how we want to try and shape that environment across our national interest. And why the foreign minister on the 21st of April launched and made quite a significant speech, which anyone can find online if they'd like to have a quick Google. You can find the entirety of the strategy at internationalcybertech.gov.au if you're interested. Quick plug there to have a search there. But really, again, it's saying that these issues are central to our foreign policy. And that we want to be able to benefit from the growth of that connected, prosperous and resilient Indo-Pacific, which is enabled by safe and secure critical technologies. And the response to those challenges presented by cyberspace and critical technologies are guided by our values as a liberal democratic country. And I think, that values piece is a really interesting conversation to have, is how can you shape values in cyberspace and the critical technology environment. So, what do we want? Just give you a quick overview. Well, it's based around 3 key elements. I always try and shy away from calling them pillars. We have an absolute obsession in government with calling having strategy pillars. So here are the 3 key elements of our strategy. It begins around that values piece. What are the core values we want to see technology embody? So how can you bake in some of those values, good values, we think, at the outset of the technology development cycle, but also how can we impact upon the values with which technologies are then absorbed into the international system? The standards environment and the way that these technologies are utilized with populations or to shape them positively. And that's something we're committed to is pursuing a values-based approach. And try and ensure that we're opposing efforts to undermine the values. And look, we're not trying to reinvent the wheel in terms of those values. We've worked very hard over hundreds of years to embed those values into our societies. So it's, democratic principles, human rights, ethics, ethical standards, diversity and gender equality. Again, all these things that have taken many hundreds of years to ensure that we have and enjoy these values, to make sure those are in the technology cycle too. But from a security point of view, it's almost pretty self-explanatory, but it's really about how do we ensure international peace and stability? How do we counter disinformation and misinformation? How do we uplift cybercrime in certainly our direct region, but how do we impact that globally? How do we combat cybercrime, which is so readily now becoming ever more impactful at the geostrategic level than perhaps at any other previous point? And how do we address the online harms and safety piece too? And then the final part of element of our strategy, I'm still shying away from use of the word pillar, is around the prosperity side of this, this is still, and I love the fact that in my job I get to talk about this. This is a fundamental opportunity for our societies, our governments, our businesses, writ large, which is this economy is growing at a rate of knots. The digital economy, if you want to call it that, really, I think it's just the mainstream economy and the way in which these technologies will really define the economies over the coming century. So how do we ensure that there's a regional connectivity piece in that so that others get to enjoy some of those benefits too? How do we ensure that our markets and supply chains are resilient and accessible? How do we try and enhance our research, industry and innovation cycles and promote those internationally? How do we shape critical technology standards, internet governance? How do we ensure we're still in that conversation because it's not gone away and there's some very direct hands playing in that, which are trying to reshape the way that the internet is governed and run? And finally, how do we then define our digital trade relationships? I'm pleased to say Australia's got a pretty good history in that. Looks like UK and Australia are in pretty good shape on that front as well. And it's certainly something that we're working hard on to ensure that we are ever increasingly including the critical technology piece in our trade relationships as well. So those are our, if you like, the broad brush. But how do we do that? Well, it's through working together. And I'm always struck in this environment, whether it's talking about cybersecurity or the broader objectives that we have, you will always hear about collaboration. And I don't think it's something any of us should take lightly. I'm always reminded whenever I talk about collaboration of a speech that I got to see in Perth. I was running a very rapid, intensive program in Perth, but ensured that I got to go and see Mike Rogers, the ex-head of NSA, speak. Good friend, colleague, and fascinated to hear what he had to say in this open conference. And he started off by saying, the cybersecurity problems that we face are far bigger than any one of us as nations and as leaders. Therefore, the only way we're going to work our way out of the problems which we're increasingly seeing is through collaboration. And obviously, as a diplomat, I mercilessly milk that for everything it's worth and recollect it where I can, because that's the ex-head of perhaps the most significant signals intelligence agency on the planet, saying that the only way we're going to get out of this is through collaboration and diplomacy. So certainly, that's something that I think is important for all of us to remember. So we need to be thinking about how we collaborate with like-minded partners, also with those who don't always agree with us, because clearly that's where some of the friction is and will lie in the future. How do we think creatively about how we work, if you like, the middle ground, unconventional partners who have a stake in this game and perhaps have not been considered so directly in terms of traditional diplomatic ties, but might be incredibly useful in shaping the way the conversation is directed. We're working very hard through collaborations like the Quad formation, established groups on cybersecurity, issues on critical technology and emerging technology issues, in looking at ways that we can collaborate around standards, around horizon scanning, on common visions of what the tech environment should look like. And we think these new and emerging ways of working together are going to become ever more important, bilaterally, minilaterally. I think you're going to see more and more of this kind of work in the international system. But that doesn't detract from the fact that the United Nations work will still be absolutely vital to all of us. I'm sure we'll talk about it more. I think we've had a pretty successful outcome through both of the UN open-ended working group and also the UN group of government experts. I think genuinely that's a good result and really something now for us to work harder on in terms of helping other countries implement the norms that we've agreed to there, in helping them understand that international legal piece and how it applies. The fact that we got international humanitarian law into the UN group of government experts, that's a real win. And that's fantastic to see these kinds of words now appearing in documentation and vital for us. And the final thing I'll say is around the capacity building side of the house. We put a lot of importance and a lot of investment in that area. Our capacity building now is going beyond the cybersecurity uplift work that we do, whether that be policy, technical assistance, international law training, understanding of norms, how we can enable other countries to engage in those processes, to now thinking about the new and emerging technology environment. How do we help other countries understand the standard setting environment and help them engage in that conversation? How do we assist other countries in looking at associated risks with new technology developments, especially when they're fundamental infrastructure development cycles, so that they can make their own national decisions, but making informed decisions through those processes. So we've invested now a total of just over $100 million in our capacity building since 2017. And I think it shows the value that we put in that. And we've been working very proactively with the UK. And I'm really excited to see how we're going to work ever more together now with the integrated review, with the Indo-Pacific focus. Certainly that's an active conversation that myself and Will are engaging in, is, well, how do we make the most of what we're good at and the money that we're provided to deliver a national interest? Where can we do that jointly to combine and ensure that we are enhancing others' ability to do these things well? I think I'll conclude there because I've probably gone on way longer than I was meant to. Madeleine, you're a very generous chair. Thank you very much for letting me ramble on. And I'm really excited to hear everyone else and the conversation that ensues. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Toby. That was incredibly interesting, and yeah, I think really, demonstrated what a complex and endlessly fascinating issue of international peace and security this is, and really for the reasons of the three pillars, not pillars, elements that you outlined. Please, Will, over to you.
Great. Well, I will also try and avoid reference to pillars, if, as an act of diplomatic solidarity. Well, first of all, thank you very much to Rusi for putting this together. I only wish I could sort of wander up Whitehall and do it in person. While it's nice and convenient to do it like this, it's always better to do these things in person. And it's also a real pleasure to be sharing the virtual stage with Toby. Toby was one of the first global cyber ambassadors, and he's very much the template, I think, for many of us who are coming to this community more recently. He's done a huge amount to put cyber diplomacy at the heart of our foreign security and economic policy, and is genuinely a groundbreaker in this field. So he's a great partner for the UK. And actually, we have no closer partner than Australia on these issues. That That applies across our strategic relationship. You heard about the trade deal that we just struck, but even more so on cyber and critical technologies. Of course, that is founded on the strength of our intelligence partnership, but it also takes shape in the coordination between our UN cyber negotiators, in our invitation to Australia to join the G7 talks this summer, and in our cooperation, as you heard from Toby, on cyber capacity building programs. And when I asked a colleague yesterday if they had any thoughts on what I might say today, they suggested I just agree with Toby. So, you know, I'll try to do slightly more than that, but it's a good basis to work on. And it's certainly a reflection, I think, of our strong partnership. But let me start by celebrating, I think, the fact that the moment for cyber and technology diplomacy has arrived. For a long time, I think this discipline was seen as niche or marginalized, but today we are increasingly seeing it at the heart of our national security, economic and foreign policy. And I'll just give you 4 examples over the last few months. You know, we were very proud as sort of chair of the G7 that the leader and ministerial discussions covered ransomware, telecoms diversification, digital standards, and the application of international law in cyberspace. When President Biden met President Putin, the US president challenged his counterpart to rein in cybercrime groups and handed over a list of 16 sectors of CNI that were deemed off limits. At the NATO summit, allies endorsed a new cyber defense policy. And in the UN, as you heard from Toby, the group of government experts agreed a new set of principles to prevent conflict in cyberspace. That is quite a catalogue in a few months of cyber diplomacy. And most importantly, it's elevated beyond the domain of people like Toby and I to national leaders, national security advisors, permanent representatives and presidents. And that's a big step forward, I think. That increased importance is absolutely set out in the UK's integrated review of security, defence, development and foreign policy that was published in March. And let me draw out 3 elements, I think, that underpin our approach now to cyber and technology security. First of all, the IR sets out the UK's ambition to be a responsible, democratic cyber power. Now, that's first of all a recognition that cyber power is now a critical national asset, but also that it's built on the broadest foundations of our defensive capabilities, our research and development, our industrial and skills base, our diplomatic relationships, and our thought leadership. But it deliberately frames that within democratic values of accountability and support for a rules-based international order. So, of course, we are developing military cyber capabilities to compete on the modern battlefield. And actually, we would say it's irresponsible to ignore that. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't also develop the rules and norms which apply to cyber capabilities used for national security and defence. And just as Australia does, projecting our values in cyberspace is just as important as projecting our security and our prosperity. In fact, we would say that they are absolutely interlinked. Second, the IR elevates science and technology to the highest importance as a component of our national security, including boosting our capability, but also managing the risks more actively of global technology supply chains. We think we're building on really strong foundations in the UK, in our scientific research, in our incubation of tech unicorns, and in a flourishing range of cyber exports. But that has to be anchored in a strong network of alliances and international scientific partnerships. Most importantly, as Toby says, the IR is honest that critical technologies are now the battleground of state competition and strategic advantage. So we need to be much clearer about where we are vulnerable and how we're going to close those vulnerabilities. We have established a model of own, collaborate and access to look at each critical technology where we need to have that capability ourselves, where we need to collaborate in the development, manufacturing, research of that technology, or just be able to be confident in our ability to access it. Now, it's really important that I underline this isn't a fast track to protectionism. Anybody who studied the IR will find multiple references to our commitment to free markets and open societies. And in actual fact, we believe the answer to vulnerability is in part through market diversification, ensuring that no supplier can apply monopoly leverage in the control of critical technologies. The final area I want to draw out from the IR is its exhortation to UK policymakers to shape the future international order. Now, that's not about tearing down the structures that have served UK security and prosperity so well for the last 70 years, but it is a recognition that there are new areas of international cooperation and competition, for instance, in space or cyberspace, where we want to develop new global governance, norms, and laws. This audience will be very familiar, I hope, with the UK's commitment to a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace, but that is fundamentally being challenged at the moment, not just from Russia or China, who are applying their own limits to those principles, but there are multiple other states in the international system who fear the apparently anarchic realm, their increased vulnerability in cyberspace, and the power of distant global technology companies. So in reply, as democracies, we all need to offer an alternative vision of the benefits of free trade in goods and ideas, of the economic efficiency and innovation that flows from new technology, and of the individual privacy and data security that we can provide. But we should also expect states, industry, and individuals to behave in cyberspace as they would elsewhere, that this isn't a lawless domain where states are powerless. And as we've seen in the twin processes in the UN this year, we can find consensus on the principles of security and state behavior in cyberspace, even with countries like the UK, Australia, China, and Russia in the same room. That's a big step forward. It is painful multilateral negotiation, but it does show that we can find common ground. So where does that leave the next UK cyber strategy, and how does that correspond to what you've heard from Toby? Well, we're hoping to launch that strategy later this year, most probably after the next 3-year spending round this autumn. We recognise that leaves a gap since the IR, but of course it's the right thing to publish a strategy that is costed, agreed, and integrated with other government priorities. And we absolutely take our marching orders from the IR. So like Australia, we're expanding the strategy beyond core cybersecurity. We're deliberately planning a cyber strategy that draws on the broadest definition of cyber power and links up with other government strategies in state threats, investment security, industrial strategy, or access to critical technologies. Like Australia, we will seek to promote a balanced pursuit of our values, security, and prosperity in the new strategy. As the Foreign Secretary said in his speech to Cyber UK last month, we still see cyber and new technologies an opportunity to be embraced as a transformational creation for our economy and society, and an area where we believe the UK can be a force for good. Now, of course, securocrats like myself need to manage those risks, but we can't eliminate them absolutely. Someone told me early on in this job, the only safe internet isn't actually the internet, or not as we know it. And having sat through multiple Whitehall debates about these new challenges, I can tell you those 3 elements of security, prosperity, and values are baked into our deliberations. Also, like Australia, we see this as a whole of government, whole of society endeavour. And I think the UK was one of the first to recognise and organise in this way. So with 10 years of kind of cyber governance under our belt, we instinctively see this as a collaborative effort, both internally and externally. We recognise the importance of partnership with industry, academia, civil society, and the NCSC is a model for this approach. Public-facing, civilian-led, processes state-based intelligence alongside insights from big tech. So a similar approach, we need to take a similar approach in building and certifying the UK skills base. So look, just to finish, let me give you a taster for what the UK National Cyber Strategy will contain. We're still considering it, but I think, I can give you an element that it will be structured around 5 elements. Let's call it 5 themes to assuage Toby's prejudices. First of all, resilience. That's going to remain at the heart of what we do. We want to build a cyber resilient economy and society. Enables the UK to be an early adopter of digital technologies, but also confident in data security and privacy, and able to respond quickly when things go wrong. They will go wrong. It's our ability to respond which determines our strength. Second, We need to counter and deter the cyber threats to the UK, whether state or non-state, from cyber criminals. We want to be a harder environment for cyber threat actors, and we intend to be harder edged in our response. And we will expand our tools to deter, disrupt, detect, and counter those who attack us. Third, explicitly, we talk about harnessing the potential of technology to enhance our prosperity and security while mitigating the risks. That includes a policy and regulatory regime that allows us to set, apply, and export the rules which make the UK the safest, most attractive place to do business online. Fourthly, we need to build the ecosystem, strengthening our supply of cyber skills and talent, and developing stronger partnerships that I've just talked about. And then fifthly, underpinning all of that, we need an international engagement which secures the UK's vision of a free, open, peaceful, and secure cyberspace. Building the partnerships and coalitions to access that critical technology, to respond to those who are attacking us, and to shape that vision of international governance, including through the cyber capacity building we've discussed. The other change this year is that this is all now overseen by a new ministerial cyber group, chaired by our Foreign Secretary in his role as First Secretary of State. And that is a real kind of step forward in political leadership, interest, and drive in this area, bringing together ministers across government, integrating cyber and critical technology with our other national security and economic interests. That gives you a sense of the elevated importance and the political priority this issue now has. So I hope that gives you a good sense of where we are, where we're going, but also fundamentally the really close alignment with our Australian friends. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Will. Yes, plenty of alignment there. There are some questions coming through in the Q&A, and we will turn to those shortly. First, I'd like to ask Camino Kavanagh to please just respond to those two presentations. Camino?
Thank you, Madeleine, and hi, Toby. It's been a while. It's great to see you again. And hi, Will. I've not met you yet in person, but evidently I know of you. It's a pleasure to share this platform with you today. It's funny reading through both documents this morning and last night. I can hear the voices of Kat Jones and Joanna Weaver coming out very, very strongly, having read both the documents, but also the UK and Australia submissions to both the Open-Ended Working Group and the GGE over the past couple of years. Both Kat and Joanna are amongst a really great group of experts in both groups and amongst a small core of really great women negotiators in both teams. I'm going to run quickly through what I saw as really important points given the global focus on these issues, and also this kind of juncture that we're at, both internationally, multilaterally, but also in terms of new alignments and new relationships. So both approaches evidently place critical technologies and cyber affairs at the center of their strategic outlook. They acknowledge a shifting international environment in which existing norms and values are being questioned or contested by some states, and I would also add from within our own states, which is a big problem that we're having. They acknowledge the growing centrality of science and technology, cyber and other critical technologies to states' posturing on the global stage and to the attainment of their economic, political and security interests. They acknowledge the benefits of the technologies for society, the economy and national security, but they also demonstrate an acute awareness of the risks associated with the technologies and how they can and are being used or abused by states and non-state actors alike. So this goes from mass surveillance to attacks targeting critical infrastructure, providing essential services to the public, attacks targeting infrastructure critical to national security, disinformation, misinformation, and there's many more. The response frameworks of both approaches, I believe, and I think are very strongly anchored in existing international law and norms and largely reflect the outcome of 2 decades of diplomatic work within the UN General Assembly's First Committee on Disarmament and International Security, its GGEs and the Open-Ended Working Group. So with conflict prevention and international security and stability as a core objective, these groups have over time produced a framework strongly cemented in international law norms confidence building and international cooperation, capacity building and assistance. Both approaches are pragmatic in their acknowledgement that not all states adhere to this framework and the fact that malicious behaviors can be very destabilizing. Thus, they bring in additional elements requiring further diplomatic action. These include cooperation. These elements include further cooperation with like-minded states on raising the costs of such behaviors and moving towards greater transparency and accountability in the development and deployment, for example, of offensive capabilities, while simultaneously ensuring that such actions do not in themselves drive instability. I would add that this framework also provides an important framework for citizens in our own countries to hold our governments accountable for their actions when they themselves do not adhere to the commitments in this framework. This is a conversation that I think needs to be part of the broader discussion, and that hasn't really permeated upwards yet. The complexities of implementing the new approaches are also acknowledged in the emphasis in both documents on the need to strengthen national governance mechanisms or standing up new ones. My own colleagues at King's have been quite engaged in this specific issue relevant to the integrated review, having submitted evidence suggesting the need to review the unit structures and processes supporting the National Security Council, for example. And then both strategic outlooks move beyond ICTs or cyber technologies to include emerging technologies deemed critical to the economy, society, and national security, with diplomatic action around these converging with defense and development, evidently, and of course of other key areas, all of them central to ensuring an open international order. And they also raise the importance of engaging in new cooperative arrangements on how to ensure that certain new technologies, and here I would add predictive algorithms, biotechnology, or technologies allowing space resource exploitation, ensuring that they do not exacerbate existing socioeconomic inequalities, or how best to respond to new encroachments on personal privacy involving not just data, but also the body and the brain. Something that I think we also need to discuss more at the societal level. And both documents discuss evidently the importance of engaging with other actors, notably the private sector, academia, and civil society in implementing and adhering to national strategies. So there's lots more in both documents. There's a lot of convergence between the documents, evidently, but I also have a number of questions for both Will and Toby. So for all the first one, I think is more from an historical perspective and very linked to my own research, my own PhD research. So for all the world shrinking capacity and promises of new world orders and peaceful relations between states throughout history, information technologies have consistently accentuated geopolitics, territorial sovereignty, upended societal norms, often at a time when international law, international order and its legitimating principles are being contested. As mentioned, both documents suggest that we are again at a critical juncture in international order, perhaps at a new inflection point in world history. So if this is the case, are current diplomatic strategies strong enough to carry us through? How can concerted diplomatic action help ensure, and this I take from the integrated review, that existing laws, rules, and norms currently used to manage international cooperation and competition, and the institutions that enable countries to come together to tackle common problems, appeal to all and are fit for purpose? Evidently, both documents refer to this, but it's not very clear at times how, when the norms and principles are being contested, how we can also sell a narrative, not sell a narrative, but develop a narrative, but also action that appeals to everybody and not just ourselves. And then something dear to my heart at the moment, because I'm writing something with Madeline, to what extent can semi-formal diplomacy, not just formal official diplomacy, including track 2 efforts, support the diplomatic efforts you have both mentioned, not just with like-minded states, but also with those who don't agree with us, and including through some of the unconventional arrangements that Toby mentioned. Second question to both of you, both documents mention the need for greater transparency around offensive cyber capabilities. We know that this is a highly sensitive issue, and this push for greater transparency also is an effort to ensure greater predictability and stability. Is there a risk that greater transparency will drive reciprocity? And if so, how can reciprocity be accommodated strategically, operationally, and normatively? I think both documents actually do refer to this in different ways, as do your national views on international law. But I'd be keen to hear more from a diplomatic perspective. I have other questions relating to the emerging technologies, including these body and brain encroachments. But I also, especially on this and the proliferation of principles to the practical application of and acknowledgement of challenges and limitations around new technologies. There are multiple efforts underway to deal with these issues, but they do remain quite fragmented. And I know there's a push to ensure greater coordination. But how can we deal with these issues when many of the technologies are designed for profit making alone and their trajectories are entirely dependent on market forces rather than actual shared values? And then finally, two last questions, one for Will. Will, the integrated review has a new section on conflict and instability and the standing up of a whole new center, I think. This is a great step. I did notice that in that section, there's no reference to cyber or other technologies, although it's increasingly evident that in existing armed conflicts, such as those referred to here, belligerents are increasingly relying on the technologies in pursuit of their political or military aims, either directly or by services provided by third states or third actors. To what extent will the greater emphasis on cyber dispute resolution and legal diplomacy play a role in dealing with these new challenges moving forward? And then Toby, I really like the idea in the Australian strategy that the framework of responsible behaviour in cyberspace could potentially be used as a model for responding to threats and risks emerging around other technologies. Do you see efforts like this emerging within the First Committee? And what might the challenges be? And what other actors? It's been difficult enough to get non-state actors involved in a very meaningful way. I mean, there's steps being taken in that direction. But when we're moving into synthetic biology, different applications of AI, et cetera, becomes very, very complex, and particularly when relevant to international security. So I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about this. I think it's a really interesting possible way forward. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Camino. It's incredibly thoughtful and insightful. We haven't got a lot of time left, about 10 minutes. I'd like to ask first Toby and then Will to respond to Camino, but also if I could integrate or just introduce a couple of questions from the audience as well, and then you can pick and choose which parts of Camino's intervention and which questions you want to respond to. Just Toby, there was someone picked up in your presentation this term, you referred to unconventional partners. And I think there's a curiosity there about who those might be. And then to both of you, there's also a question in here about the future of global standards and this shift that we've seen relatively recently, really, from technical standards being regarded as something very dry and boring for the technical community and engineers to deal with, to something that's really fundamentally imbued with power and a very important element of shaping the geopolitics of emerging technologies. Wonder if both of you could speak to that as well, please. Toby, go ahead, 5 minutes if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, let's see if I could do justice to that immense set of questions. Here we go. Camino, as ever, awesome, on the ball. Right, firstly, I would say, don't see this strategy by itself. And then I think it does, if you take it in the context of 3 pieces of work, it then becomes a very robust message in terms of our commitment to cyber and tech issues. Look at the cybersecurity strategy from 2020 that our Home Affairs Department pulled together. That's the defense side of the house. How do we defend ourselves? How do we make it more difficult for us to be a target? How do we do that across the economy, across the whole of nation? Secondly, look at our defense strategic update, which was also released in 2020. Big slice of that, which is around cyber capability, both offensive and also workforce issues, huge investments, billions and billions of dollars poured into our defense capability. And then thirdly, the diplomacy side, which is evident through this strategy. When you take those three together, it then is a very powerful message to, I think, most countries in understanding what we're about. And I'm also with Will on this. It's really important from a transparency point of view that we are talking about offensive cyber capability. It's often thrown back against us that we're trying to basically promote an arms race in cyberspace. Look, we're not trying to do that. We totally appreciate that states will develop these capabilities. If we are not talking about them and not setting some sort of understanding of where and when they may be used, then the potential for miscalculation, misinterpretation, and all those things that we work so hard to not get into situations around just increases exponentially. So to be frank, it's unacceptable that certain states who quite obviously have an offensive capability refuse to admit that and actually have a sensible conversation in the room about what that looks like and lay down some doctrine. This is stuff that I try not to draw too many comparisons to the Cold War, but you saw it done around nuclear doctrine and the kind, how that settled down certain situations and understanding just enough about each other so that you knew where the lines were drawn and could create some stability. Track 2 diplomacy, really super important, especially when it's hard for certain countries to have conversations together. Vital part of the equation. Used to do a lot of that in the past. We've put a lot of effort and funding into some of that track 2 diplomacy, perhaps more visibly between partners, so through something called the Quad Tech Network. You can have a look at that, which is supporting a good, interesting thinking into the Quad work. What else can I say before I hand over to Will to have the last word? And I'm trying to stick within my 5 minutes. On the emerging technology space, one thing that we tried to do in the strategy around, the framework of responsible state behavior, what we've just tried to say is be adventurous insofar as saying we shouldn't be treating all these technologies as unique when it comes to that international legal conversation. And you rightfully point out there's a real danger of proliferation of hundreds of conversations around each technology. Now, sometimes that's important that there's a diverse conversation, but certainly where the UN is concerned, you're beginning to see an increasing tempo of these conversations, whether it be around AI ethics for military use of AI, and a whole range of other issues. And you're seeing the UN now become ever more focused on the not only cyberspace, but the critical technology environment. So something to keep an eye on. We've certainly laid down that marker to say that, again, you want same principles. This doesn't need a comprehensive rewriting of the rules. We spent hundreds of years getting to where we are in these issues. It's about interpretation of that according to the technology. I'm going to hand over to Will, otherwise I'll have hogged all of the final few minutes, and I want to hear what Will's got to say around some of those questions too.
Okay, well, I'll try my best. Let's start on global standards. I talked a little bit about our G7 presidency. We elevated that to the presidency discussions, agreed a new framework for collaboration on digital technology standards. We're going to host a future tech forum later this year. We're going to be talking about the same issues underneath the banner of our presidency. But, we recognize we do need to be more active in digital standards organizations, and we are doing that. It's moved, as everybody knows, from being, fairly informal, expert, see who turns up type discussion to being kind of an area of strategic competition. And let's be frank, that's been led by the Chinese by putting kind of state-backed experts into those positions. So we need to respond. And we are, and we will, and we need to, we need to elevate the importance of bodies like the ITU, and you're seeing that in the UK diplomacy. So yes, this is part of the wider effort. This is part of, you know, being slightly harder edged and competitive, you know, in a field that frankly 10 years ago we didn't neglect, but it suffered from benign neglect. Let's describe it like that. In answer to Camino's point on the international order and transparency, are our current strategies strong enough? I mean, I think I would say this field is pretty young, right? We only agreed the GGE norms, what, 5 years ago, you know, we have made a lot of progress. Now, in the scale of the challenge we're facing, it's not good enough. In the scale of multilateral negotiations, it's, you know, we've made big strides, and that's just the reality of negotiating with people with whom you sometimes have fundamental disagreement, never mind bridging differences across 193 states. But, you know, look at the progress we've made in the OEWG and the GGE, and aligning with Russia and China on some fairly difficult principles. You know, just actually look at state behavior, not even non-state behavior in cyberspace. People are actually following unwritten norms, and sometimes written norms. People, you know, states are curtailing their behavior. Even, you know, DarkSide said that it didn't want to attack, you know, CNI, you know, even if it was acting as ransomware as a service. So it's interesting that those norms are starting to infect the debate, even if, you know, frankly, we'd like a little bit more enforcement. On the transparency point, we are not naive that us being more transparent will lead to reciprocity, but we do think it's important as a responsible democratic actor that we are more transparent, because it's normative, we believe, and we do believe there is kind of a coalition to rally around. Finally, on conflict and instability, I mean, it's a fair point about, you know, the absence of the word cyber or reference to cyber weaponry in conflict. I mean, I think, you know, we would say in our defense, cyber capabilities are still the preserve of a kind of a few advanced states and actors, and we're not seeing them yet in the majority of conflicts. But we absolutely recognize the risk of proliferation from advanced actors into kind of commercial sales, and it's in this wider application. So it is coming, which is why we need to kind of get ahead of the game. I think that's probably my 4 minutes up. Sorry, I couldn't go on further.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, Toby, and thank you, Camino. I think and thank you to Rusi for organizing this. Just a beautiful kind of exploration of the ways that diplomacy is shaping emerging technology, but also I think in reference to Will and Toby's comments about the rise of cyber ambassadors and these kind of emerging posts, the way that digital technologies is also shaping diplomacy and the way we engage with international partners and competitors. We're at time. I'd like to thank everyone for their participation, our speakers especially, and very much so the audience. I'm sorry we didn't have more time for Q&A, but an hour was just really probably not enough to explore this, and we'll perhaps can structure a follow-up some way. Thanks again, Camino, Will, and Toby. Great to see you all, and see you again soon.
Thanks, everyone.